I'm a conversation strategist. I work with governments and businesses around the world, helping them to have consequential conversations that move the world. I like to think of it as helping smart people have simple conversations that make the world a better place. And in my line of work, I moderate panel discussions around the world and I facilitate strategic conversations. And one of the most common conversations that keeps coming up, irrespective of which global stage I'm on, is the conversation on women. And in particular, the conversation about the empowerment of women and African women in particular. If there was an award to be given for the most topical conversation of our time, the conversation on women and how we give them a more just and a more fair experience of their daily lives would win it hands down. And so much so that this decade, 2010 to 2020, was actually declared the decade of the African woman. So in 2008, presidents, together with their ministers, gather all together, they head over to Addis Ababa, and they declare that from 2010 to 2020, we are going to be having a conversation about women. Conversations that are going to put women at the front and center of policy. Conversations that are going to push us to galvanize every single possible resource so that we're understanding the issues of women. We're making the empowerment of women a reality. And we're not just doing this for women, but we're doing it with women. And so, ladies and gentlemen, for the past 10 years, we've had a conversation about women. We've unpacked their issues, we've unpacked their challenges, their aspirations, what women should do, what men should do, what government should, what business should do, what academia should do, what civil society should do. But what have we really done? What have our conversations really achieved? Today, we are 17 days away from the end of the decade for African women. And if I were to ask the more than 500 million women on this continent whether our conversations have delivered a just and a fair world, the response would be a resounding no. So why is it that our conversations don't go out and move the world? Why is it that our conversations are not consequential? And in trying to answer these questions for myself, as a conversation strategist, trying to understand why some of the conversations that I moderate and that I facilitate, some of them actually have no impact whatsoever. And others go out and move the world. What is the secret ingredient that leads us to conversations that move the world compared to conversations that die at the end of a sentence? And to try to understand this, I've come to a realization that there is an answer, but the answer requires a little bit of imagination. So, I'm going to ask you to invite me to your favorite clothing store, the one that has all the brands that you love, that you aspire towards. I could imagine that this store is somewhere in a sexy, attractive location. And that as we approach, we are beckoned by the lights and the ambience. The displays are calling at us. We're probably met with by a shop assistant who probably looks like they've stepped off the cover of a magazine. We get inside this shop and we engage with the shop floor, and there are the beautiful products lined up, waiting for us. And we're told by those who design shop floors that this is not about the transaction. This is about the experience. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's precisely the problem with the conversations that we're having. We've taken the blueprint of the shop floor, and then we're confused when we get a talk shop at the end of it. If we think about the conferencing industry, an industry that we have entrusted to carry the most important conversations of our time, the best conferences, the most well-attended, are in sexy, attractive locations. The lights, the ambience that we spoke about, we see it. It's the pomp, it's the ceremony, it's the protocol, it's the entertainment, it's the singers and the dancers. And no shop floor is complete without product. And so we go to look for speakers with sexy sound bites and a social media footprint in the hundreds of thousands. And the culmination of all these decisions that we've taken is that the conversation becomes a supporting act to the production. So, I'm going to ask you to lend me your imagination, and I'm going to take you to another place. We're going to a factory. It's angular, it's gray, it's unattractive, it's probably squatting somewhere at the edge of some city. But looking at the principles that underlie effective factories, whether it's a factory in Johannesburg, in Sao Paulo, in Bangladesh, or Munich, I've realized that this is where the framework for consequential conversations that move the world actually exists. Factories can teach us 5 things that if we did these 5 things as we engage in conversation, maybe, just maybe, we'd start to move the world. So the first thing that factories tell us is that they're intentional. No factory exists for the sake of just existing. Every factory is there because there's a product that has to be delivered at the end of a process. And so if we began to have conversations where the starting point of the conversation is, what do I actually want to achieve out of this conversation? Things might be slightly different. Factories tell us that they're not the end, they're a means to an end. They are there to produce a product. Conversations, too, are a means to an end. We often make the mistake of thinking that if we've had the conversation, we've reached the end. Think about gender-based violence conversations. Having the conversation on a panel discussion doesn't change the reality that for many women, that very night, they are going to be the victims of a loved one putting their hands on them. Conversations are a means to an end. And so I've begun to ask my clients, what is the job that you're hiring this conversation to do? And once we understand the job that we want the conversation to do, we get better clarity around the intent of the conversation. I'm also quickly learning that when I engage with my partner in those big, hairy conversations, instead of saying, we need to talk, I've learned to rather say, there's a conversation that I'd like us to have, and this is what I'd like for us to get out of it. Once we bed down intentionality, factories tell us to be efficient. They tell us that they don't have any tolerance for any wastage. Everything that is in a factory, from the workers to the machinery to the supervisors with their clipboards, is there because it contributes to the process. Now, what we're really good at in conversation is all the things that we hide behind: the pomp, the ceremony, the flowery language, the politeness that sometimes is so excessive that it stops us from having a conversation. And the impact of this is that we actually create shields that we hide behind when we're either too ashamed or too afraid or just too shy to say what we really want to say. A few weeks ago, I was in Egypt, and an American journalist who was moderating a session before me got up onto stage, and he had in front of him 6 African heads of state. And he said to them, don't tell me that 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies are in Africa. We know that. Don't tell me about how Africa is going to be home to the largest population by 2050. We know that. Don't tell me about the narrative of Africa rising. We know that. And so I watched systematically as he cut through the noise and just got to the point. And what was amazing was the impact that it had on the conversation. So I walk away from this lesson of efficiency asking myself, what would I really say in conversation if I wasn't afraid, if I wasn't ashamed, if I had nothing to hide behind, and I really said what I wanted to say? And that is a lesson that we need to embody if we're going to get to conversations that move the world. Factories tell us that they're there to add value. They take raw material, take it through a process, and out of that process, you get a product. And when we think about that process, we realize that adding value starts with what you put into the system. It starts with the input. When we have conversations, who are we inviting into the room? Whose voice are we validating as an input? For too long, I've had conversations about young people without a single young person on the panel. For too long, I've had conversations about the future, with the people on the panel most likely not going to be there in that future that we're talking about. And for too long, we've had conversations about women without a single woman on the panel. And so what lands for me out of this insight is you cannot have conversations on behalf of other people. You have to invite the people who the conversation is intended to impact in the room. So think about it like a non-transferable invitation. The people whose lives will be moved by the conversation have got to be in the room. And then factories tell us, well, we're here because we want to be transformative. We transform from one state to another. We take a piece of leather and we turn it into a shoe. We take these component parts of a car and we turn it into a Mercedes-Benz. And I have had rare moments of seeing the magic of transformation in conversation. Earlier this year, I was in Abidjan, sitting on a panel and having a very common conversation in the African landscape. How do we bridge the digital divide so that we're not leaving young women and girls behind? One of my panelists, who's actually one of the commissioners at the African Union, signals to me that she wants to make a contribution. And she says, Nozipho, I'm just going to be honest. I can sit here and tell you that when I ask my daughter if she wants to be an astronaut or a pilot, she gives me an answer. But I'll tell you what she tells me. She says, well, every time and everything that I hear indicates that perhaps my highest achievement is to be a very comfortable and well-kept housewife. And in that moment, the conversation shifted. No longer were we having a conversation about how do we invest in infrastructure so that there is a digital divide that women and young girls can be a part of in terms of closing that gap. But we're now having a conversation about the contextual nuance that young girls are subjected to even when they are in a world that is trying to push them to be part of this new digitalized world. And so in that moment, the magic of transformation happened because we stopped having the conversation we thought we needed to have. And we allowed the conversation to lead us to new questions. We allowed the conversation to frame a new reality and a new conversation that needed to be had in that moment. And so conversations tell us you've got to be transformative. And finally, factories tell us that, well, we operate on economies of scale. We're always trying to see how do we do more with less. And perhaps one of the greatest misconceptions about conversations that move the world is that they happen on global stages. They don't. Conversations that move the world happen in small, intimate circles of trust. When I'm conversing with somebody that I trust, I'm far more open for my thoughts, my values, my universal truths to be challenged. And so the learning begins. And I take that learning and I go and I impart it in another circle of trust. And then the catalytic power of conversations in that moment is absolutely unleashed. We don't scale conversations by getting onto global stages. We scale conversations by having them with people whom we trust and people that trust us. And so, ladies and gentlemen, maybe, just maybe, in this next decade, if we had conversations that were intentional, and we asked of every conversation, what is the job that we want this conversation to do? if we had conversations that were efficient, we cut through the noise and got to the point of what we really wanted to say. If we had conversations that add value, because the people that we are talking about are part of those conversations, driving, leading, shaping those conversations. If we had conversations where our focus was to be transformative, allowing ourselves to be guided towards breakthrough thinking and new questions and new framings of the conversation. And if we allowed ourselves to believe that it's not about chasing global stages, but it's about moving the person you're in conversation right with right now. And that's how you move people in conversation, and that's how you move the world. Then maybe, just maybe, we might have a decade of conversations that move the world, not only for women, but for job creation, for peace, for prosperity, and for every other conversation that we need to have for this world to be just and to be fair for all of us. Thank you very much.